Thanks. Okay, I'm going to speak just briefly about a project we've really just started looking at forest composition and structure post yellow cedar decline. This is work that Vanessa and I primarily are coordinating, but all the folks listed at the top there have been partners in conceptualizing and designing the work or implementation to this point. Folks mainly from SFU and UBC, but also some of our transboundary partners from the US as well. Vanessa has already spoken pretty comprehensively, as have others, about the mechanisms of induced decline, climate-induced decline. So we'll leave that, and certainly Will spoke to some of the anticipated increase in severity and intensity of that decline in BC in the future. So suffice to say that despite some fairly intensive study of causal mechanisms, there really have been few studies to this point on post-decline stand composition and dynamics. The work in Southeast Alaska by Lauren Oakes and colleagues showed primarily that Western hemlock becomes a canopy dominant or is likely to. Also some relative changes in grasses over bryophytes at early stages of decline, some increases in shrubs cover later relative to places without decline, but that hemlock becoming dominant ultimately in older or more intensive areas of decline. But what things will look like in BC is sort of yet to be determined. And there are some fairly important implications for a number of values provided by this species. Okay, so things are a little bit different for us here in BC than in Southeast Alaska. Yellow cedar and red cedar are sympatric. They don't really have that situation except sort of in the south, Prince of Wales Island area for Southeast Alaska. And yellow cedar decline can occur at higher elevations in BC, primarily at sea level in Alaska. So as we go further south, we're getting that higher elevation, primarily associated with that, the combination of range and the climatic shift and that mechanism driving the decline. So to assess what the implications are for our ecosystems, we're studying post-decline stands by substituting space for time, sampling sites with ideally we were going to sample sites with no decline, recent or active decline areas, and then older areas or areas with more decline in two site types, anticipating differing levels of susceptibility of the cedar in those more hybrid versus music site conditions. And we expected that amount of age of decline also to vary by latitude and elevation. So we were blocking by those factors and anticipated having two additional nodes of study, the Prince Rupert node and then the Central Coast node that Vanessa also showed in her mapping and kind of around where Jim was talking about in Hartley Bay area. So it gets pretty complicated fairly quickly. You can see that potentially the impacts for the values of the species, the communities in which it currently appears, and then the broader landscape that's made up of these multiple plant associations really could depend on understanding multiple different successional trajectories. So it gets a little bit, it's complicated. So what we've done so far is one pilot season that Jim spoke to a bit, that he was with us on, and then one, I say full, but in quotes, field season, complicated by all sorts of COVID things, etc., at our northern study node out of Prince Rupert. Initially we had hoped to integrate actual longitudinal sampling into the design and had been tagging overstory and also, all tall saplings and doing heights for these. And after our pilot season, we scaled back a bit and I tried to accept this tactical strike focus, but I'm keen to get some feedback on this at the end if there's time. Here I've just got a table that's highlighting the climatic unit and site type and decline stage categories that were our focus this past summer. So we were focusing primarily at the lower elevation of decline up to about 450 meters, I think, in the CEDO HVH2 primarily. and kind of really looking for no decline versus any decline, and hoping that we get some range in actual amounts when we get the quantitative information all together. The sampling is a little bit modified from Oakes et al., our colleagues in Southeast Alaska, but fairly close, because it's meant to be used in analysis in comparison to those northern data. So we have a nested design with mature trees being measured and identified as species, and sort of quantified with respect to their crown and overall condition, local topography around them, understory vegetation species as indicators of sort of fine scale regeneration site condition and growth condition. Then taller and shorter saplings being measured and identified as species and quantified for condition in a 10 by 10 meter plot. Oh, I don't know if I said that the outer plot there for the mature trees is 20 by 20. And then saplings in a 10 by 10. And then we have seedlings in 4 2 by 2 meter plots within that in the corners. And then we also do back plots and pathology samples, still just to confirm or evaluate whether the mechanism of decline is the same as in Southeast, and whether there's still potentially some pathology interacting there with the climatic drivers. And then we also have canopy photos for light data. I think that's it. Yeah, oh, actually, I'm just going to quick go back here, just because it was interesting, Jim's comments on the mapping. One thing we have been pleased with between our pilot season, for which we use the hazard decline model that had been produced for the province, and use that to try to select our sites pre-field, which was an abject failure, frankly. Frequently, we didn't find yellow cedar and we didn't find decline. Which doesn't say much for the model, but that's another story. This past season, we used a combination of the aerial overview survey that Jim was talking about, and we overlaid that with VRI, expected yellow cedar presence based on the vegetation resources inventory. And so, chose sort of sub-polygons there. And then we overlaid that with expectations of the amounts of specific groups of site series within a certain distance of each other, so the circummesic versus the hygric, from our terrestrial ecosystem mapping. And then we layer on an additional requirement that there be an opening of either non-forested or non-productive types from their vegetation resources inventory of a certain size and slope, so to maximize the chance we'd be going to places where we could get all those features, the 2 site types and decline, and actually be able to get a helicopter in. So we were really pleased how that worked. So it will be interesting to see if as we head further south, if we do, whether that ends up being useful. And I don't know, Jim, maybe we can pass on this. It might be useful for you too, this new approach to finding sites. Okay, so now we're pulling these first data sets together. We're trying to make some decisions about sampling moving forward. I would say that the realities of the sampling are that it's difficult to find a range of decline within the initial focal elevation band. In particular, difficult to find apparent circummesic sites with a range of decline. So we're trying to do kind of a regression type analysis here, and worried that we're not going to get kind of a good range to evaluate these trajectories. And then frankly, it's difficult to access everything, period, no matter what you do. So sample sizes are small, and then some parts of the sampling scheme itself are challenging. So difficult, for example, to tell those seedlings apart. We are trying to decide between some trade-offs of sort of reduced sampling intensity within a site, versus maintaining that intensive site-specific sampling because of the high variability among sites, and dropping the number of samples, and trying to figure out what will work best to answer these questions. Right now, we're at the stage where we're thinking that the most informative course would be to focus on the northern node itself, try to increase sample size in the initial elevation band, and add sites in the Cedar HVM2 and Mountain Hemlock above that, having kind of done a quick assessment this past summer, suggesting that we might be able to get a broader range of decline age in those bands, surprisingly. But we also need to add some other things, like just some coring to ensure we're not conflating the extent of age with decline. We just want to confirm the categories are as per proposed, for example, from Southeast Alaska. So that's what we're trying to decide right now, and feedback and thoughts on those decisions are solicited from this group. I'm hoping to hear what people think. I might just quickly say in response to Hardy's question earlier, it's a little bit hard to know at this point from our, one season what's happening. Our sites have maybe 5 to 45% canopy cover of yellow cedar. About 15 to 40% of that is dead at any one site. Maybe a bit more. Some of the stands are hard to identify between red cedar and yellow cedar, but it looks, frankly, like the hemlock still may be winning a little bit. In Southeast Alaska, they had quite an increase in Sitka spruce, but that didn't survive as well. So ultimately, the hemlock was triumphant. We just really have a trace of yellow cedar and hemlock and red cedar seedlings. So pretty tough with the small sample size yet to say.